Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us for another segment of Health Professional Radio. We're going to be speaking with Steve Sibley. He's joining us here from Synchrogenix Regulatory Science at Certara to talk about solving issues with simultaneous drug submissions for the U.S. and Europe. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Steve Sibley. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Great. Thank you, Neil. Great to be able to speak with your audience.
Well, tell us a bit about yourself and your role at Synchrogenix.
Yeah, I have actually started with a zoology background, but made the switch more than 30 years ago into the pharma industry, and have been doing regulatory writing and project leadership roles since then across a number of companies, including 11 years at AstraZeneca, but have been with Certara Synchrogenix for the past 12 years now, overseeing submission programs, so helping pharma companies complete their large applications for marketing approval for their drug products.
Now, it's my understanding that the U.S. and Europe are two of the largest pharma markets. How does simultaneous drug submission work? Explain some of the issues involved. It's
interesting having been heavily involved in submission activities for 30 years now. Seen the stage early on where there was really no opportunity for simultaneous submissions because every country and region was different and had very different requirements, very different types of documents. That all changed around 2000 with the implementation of the International Conference of Harmonization and Common Technical Documents for submissions. That was a joint collaboration between the U.S., Europe, and Japanese regulatory authorities and pharma, and created a structure and set of documents that was virtually identical across U.S., Europe, and Japan. Mm-hmm. And so that allowed companies to start generating one set of documents that could be used for multiple submissions, and so the potential to submit at the same time, basically, to all of those. Reason this topic is coming up more now is that these regions and countries have started drifting further apart again since the initial ICH guidances came out. So it's becoming more of a challenge to submit simultaneously, and so there are a lot of factors that we see now that we help sponsor companies with to develop and get as close to a simultaneous submission as they can, because separating those submissions by a month or so has implications, and trying to do it even closer is very difficult.
So if I'm understanding correctly, there was virtually no way to simultaneously submit. Then there were some guidelines that allowed for these submissions simultaneously, but the countries have started adding their own little nuances once again to make it more individualized, to make it more difficult, not necessarily to make it more difficult. Is it a competition thing between markets? Is that a factor, or are we simply just regulating ourselves into oblivion?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, set of things. So there is obviously some competition, countries wanting to be the first place companies go with their products and get new treatments into the hands of physicians and patients. And there is a lot of increased regulatory scrutiny and requirements that's being built in, especially with FDA. Otherwise, I think it's as healthcare is kind of evolving, there are new changes in the healthcare system that drive some of these requirements in each country, and that's one of the main drivers. So we see, one of the things we see that you need to be prepared for but can't really plan for is you will want to meet with regulatory authorities prior to your submission to ensure that what you're proposing to present and the data that you have is acceptable, and you don't know how those regulatory authorities are going to respond, and they may respond with different requests or demands of the sponsor company. And those meetings are held late in the process, often just 2-3 months before submission. So there isn't a lot of time for the sponsor company to adjust or do new analyses, and no time to conduct new studies. So it's something that we work closely with sponsors on to ensure that they're prepared to deal with what might come out of those regulatory authority interactions, because the EMA in Europe may say something different or that conflicts with the advice they get back from FDA in the U.S.
Not just saying something completely different, but I'm going to date myself a bit here. I can remember when, if you were using a CAD system in Britain, you were using a puck, while if you were in the United States, you were using a mouse. What about simple changes in terminology?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and one that's kind of near and dear to me, coming from a writing background, is although there are some very significant aspects, differences in healthcare and standard of care for certain diseases and conditions that can drive country and regional differences. When you're preparing the documents that you'll submit for the authorities to review, little things like in the U.S., it's an NDA, a new drug application, or a biologic license application, and in Europe it's an MAA, a marketing authorization application. So if you write in your document, as summarized in this NDA, now that's not applicable in Europe. So if you want to reuse that document for Europe, you'd have to go through and replace all the places you mentioned NDA with MAA. So it can be some really small details that need to be taken into account if you're truly trying to create a document that you don't have to touch. You can use the exact same document in both a submission to FDA and to the EMA in Europe. And so you might look for a more generic term like submission.
What is the main takeaway that you'd like our listeners to leave with? And then give us a website where we can learn more.
Yeah, so I think the main takeaway is that there are an increasing number of differences between countries in terms of filing requirements and what documents need to be submitted and what needs to be presented in them. And you can address most of those with upfront planning. So the thing that we do with sponsors that we recommend is trying to identify any possible differences that might need to be taken into account if you're looking at a simultaneous submission. And that includes, how simultaneous are we talking about, and which countries are you planning to submit to? So the take-home message is take the time up front, and I'm talking 12 months or even longer before your submission, to sit down, go through all the things that might be different, all the timing expectations for meeting with regulatory authorities, and plan that out and figure out how close you can get to creating documents that can be reused everywhere, which would then allow you to get closer to that simultaneous submission goal. In terms of a website, so Certara.com, we have a whole range of information on there. The one I think is most relevant for today's talk is I have a handout checklist on there on Certara.com around writing at light speed, which provides a checklist of all of the things that you may need to consider and take into account in planning your submission, and then be prepared to adjust to along the way.
And Certara is CERTARA.com, correct?
Correct.
Steve, I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you so much for joining us here on Health Professional Radio.
Thank you, Neil. Great to be with you today.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Steve Sibley. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at Anchor, Spotify, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Health Professional Radio.